The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals recently handed down a monumentally important decision on free speech and government censorship. The ruling affirms the lower court's determination that the Biden administration's massive operation to coerce social media platforms to suppress conservative speech on topics from the safety of COVID vaccines to election security likely violates the First Amendment, warranting a preliminary injunction against officials at the White House, the Office of the Surgeon General, the FBI, and the CDC. The Fifth Circuit determined that the Biden administration has been coercing and encouraging big tech to moderate content that the government disfavors, and that's unconstitutional. It's a big win for free speech, and I'll tell you everything you need to know about it. Then, in our deep dive segment, Joe Biden is forcing an electric vehicle revolution on the backs of American autoworkers. Biden and the leftists are setting us up for power rationing and blackouts. It's all part of the Democrats' march towards socialism. All that plus behind the headlines on today's episode of Founding Principles with Doug Wardlow.
A battle for the fate of America rages. The radical left seeks to destroy the very foundations of our republic. God, the family, and the Constitution are under attack. Amidst the chaos, Doug Wardlow speaks truth and points the way back to freedom. It is time to go on offense. This is Founding Principles with Doug Wardlow.
Before we dive in today, I'd like to welcome our new audience members watching on LindellTV. Starting with this week's show, we are joining the weekend lineup on LindellTV, which you can watch via frankspeech.com on Saturday and Sunday. So, in light of the fact that we are relaunching the show today on LindellTV, I'd like to introduce myself to those who are watching for the first time. I am your host, Doug Wardlow, and I will be here with you each week, cutting through the political drama to get to what really matters, boldly going where rhinos, that is Republicans in name only, fear to tread. In every episode, we will be happily canceling the left with the sheer force of truth and reason. Let me tell you just a little bit about me. I am a constitutional lawyer, and I have been fighting relentlessly for liberty for my entire professional career of nearly 20 years now. Early in my legal career, I began fighting government abuses of individuals' property rights in eminent domain cases. Later, I fought to vindicate the First Amendment rights of individuals and business owners as a constitutional litigator at Alliance Defending Freedom. My passion for the cause of freedom also led me to run for political office. I spent some time in the Minnesota House of Representatives. I was also the 2018 Republican nominee for Minnesota Attorney General. We came extremely close to defeating Keith Ellison that year and got more votes in a midterm than any other Republican candidate in Minnesota history. Some call me a conservative firebrand. Well, those people are correct. I am also general counsel for an absolutely outstanding company called MyPillow, where I'm honored to stand with Mike Lindell in the fight for freedom. Now, let me be very clear. Everything I say on this show today and going forward, and everything I have said on the show in the past, reflects my own personal opinions only. On this show, I always speak only on my own behalf and never on behalf of any other person or entity. As many of you know, on this show, I focus a lot on how to preserve and revive America's founding principles. Those principles that set our country apart and make it the greatest in the world. The natural rights to life, liberty, and property. The institution of the family. Freedom of religion. Freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, the rule of law, representative Republican government, the separation of powers, federalism, elections. All of those great principles stem from one initial idea. That one initial truth, that all men are created equal and are created, first of all, and then also created equally. That the Creator superintends over everything and grants to us our individual rights. That He made us free, and that government must be instituted in a manner to support and ensure and protect that freedom. You know, America can be defined in basically three words: God, family, and freedom. Those three things are under attack by the radical left. The radical left wants to redefine and thus destroy America. They would replace God with the self, families with the state, and freedom with subjugation to the elites. They would, unwittingly or wittingly, snuff out the sacred fire of liberty and usher in 1,000 years of darkness. Now, we can renew the promise of America and maximize human flourishing in our land, but only by returning America to its founding principles, all of which are rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition, valuing human life, the family, freedom, property, the rule of law, and constitutional government featuring the separation of powers. By throwing off the shackles of rule by elites, casting aside the burden of excess government, and standing up for moral truth, we can once again unleash the power of human freedom. In the end, I am confident that we will prevail, provided that we do not forget why we are fighting. We are fighting to lift people up and to let them become all that God means for them to be. So, with that background, let's dive in. A couple of weeks ago, the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit handed down one of the most significant victories for free speech and the First Amendment in decades, a decision that strikes against the heart of the censorship campaign that the leftists in the Biden administration have been waging against conservative speech across nearly every one of the major social media networks. The federal district court issued an injunction putting a halt to the Biden administration's massive censorship operation. The Biden administration appealed, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed the vast majority of the lower court's ruling. The details of the Fifth Circuit's decision should encourage all of us. It is a huge win. But before we dive into the important details of the Fifth Circuit's ruling, let's go over a little bit of the history of the lawsuit. So the lawsuit was brought by the states of Missouri and Louisiana in federal district court in the state of Louisiana against President Biden, the FBI, the CDC, the Department of Homeland Security, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is known as CISA, Dr. Anthony Fauci, and others. Former Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmidt and Louisiana AG Jeff Landry filed the lawsuit back in May of 2022. The lawsuit alleges that several Biden administration agencies and high-ranking officials worked with big tech social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, to censor and suppress free speech, including truthful information related to COVID-19, election integrity, and many other topics, all under the guise of combating so-called misinformation. The Missouri versus Biden complaint includes specific allegations concerning censorship of some of the most important consequential topics that exist in American political discourse today. It alleges that the federal government was actively working with social media companies or coercing them and forcing them to censor the Hunter Biden laptop story, to suppress speech related to the emergence of COVID-19 from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, to censor information about the efficacy of masks and the efficacy of COVID vaccines, and to suppress speech related to election integrity, election security, and the security of mail-in ballots. Of course, the suppression and censorship only extended to viewpoints and speakers that the Biden administration and the radical left disfavored. Conservative speech was singled out for suppression. The complaint in the lawsuit, Missouri versus Biden, states that the defendants, quote, have coerced, threatened, and pressured social media platforms to censor disfavored speakers and viewpoints by using threats of adverse government actions. It goes on to allege that Biden and the other defendants are now directly colluding with social media platforms to censor disfavored speakers and viewpoints, including by pressuring them to censor certain content and speakers and flagging disfavored content and speakers for censorship. The lawsuit alleges that the censorship violates the First Amendment and seeks a declaration from the court to that effect, as well as an injunction barring the defendants from continuing their censorship activities. So you can understand just how important the case is. It asked the federal court to rule that the Biden White House and all these different federal agencies have secretly colluded to suppress the dissemination of political speech that they disfavor and to control the information that Americans are exposed to on social media, from Facebook to Twitter to YouTube. The plaintiffs, Missouri and Louisiana, brought a motion for preliminary injunction. That's a motion that basically asks the court to enter an order immediately stopping the defendants from engaging in the conduct at issue, which is here censorship, while the court considers the merits of the litigation. Now, in a case like this one, where we are dealing with government actions to censor and suppress speech in violation of the First Amendment, if you win that preliminary injunction, it's pretty likely that you'll win the whole case and get a permanent injunction to replace the preliminary temporary one that is only in place for the duration of the litigation. So the hearing on that initial motion for a preliminary injunction becomes something like a mini trial within the larger litigation. Now, discovery in the case proceeded and revealed a lot of very damning information about the scope of the Biden administration's activities, coercing and encouraging social media platforms to suppress conservative speech, and that confirmed the allegations in the complaint. And so the federal district court granted the plaintiff's motion for a preliminary injunction. Now, it's one thing to get an order from a federal district court judge. That was a huge win, of course. But having that ruling largely affirmed by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, that's a monumental victory. So what did the Fifth Circuit have to say about the lawsuit and the lower court's injunction? Well, to win a motion for a preliminary injunction, the plaintiff has to demonstrate that it is likely to succeed on the merits of the lawsuit over the course of the litigation. So the Fifth Circuit wrote, quote, the plaintiffs allege that federal officials ran afoul of the First Amendment by coercing and significantly encouraging social media platforms to censor disfavored speech, including by threats of adverse government action like antitrust enforcement and legal reforms. We agree, close quote. It's powerful. The Fifth Circuit began its analysis of the merits of the plaintiff's claim for injunctive relief by observing that while the First Amendment precludes the government from abridging free speech, that's what the First Amendment does, the First Amendment ordinarily does not constrain private parties. In other words, the First Amendment only protects free speech against action by the government. It doesn't protect it against action of private parties. But the government cannot circumvent the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech by using private parties to accomplish things that would be unconstitutional if the government itself did those things. And so under the law of the First Amendment, if the government significantly encouraged a private party to suppress speech, or if the government coerced a private party to suppress speech, then the government itself violated the First Amendment. Now, it is fine for the government to advocate and defend its own policies. When the government merely asks a private party to suppress speech, that usually isn't enough on its own to establish a First Amendment violation. But when the government crosses the line from making a simple request to either significantly encouraging or coercing a private party to censor speech, well, that's a clear violation of the First Amendment. The Fifth Circuit described the test to determine whether there is significant encouragement this way, quote, whether through entanglement in a party's independent decision-making or direct involvement in carrying out the decision itself, to find significant encouragement, the government must encourage the decision to such a degree that we can fairly say it was the state's choice and not the private actors. The other way to establish that private party action constitutes state action giving rise to a First Amendment violation, coercion by the government, can be more subtle and difficult to spot. The Fifth Circuit summed up the test for coercion this way, quote, for coercion, we ask if the government compelled the decision by, through threats or otherwise, intimating that some form of punishment will follow a failure to comply. Honing in on whether the government intimated that some form of punishment will follow a failure to accede, we parse the speaker's messages to assess the word choice and tone, including the overall tenor of the party's relationship, the recipient's perception, the presence of authority, which includes whether it is reasonable to fear retaliation, and whether the speaker refers to adverse consequences. The Fifth Circuit further observed that it is not necessary that the recipient admit that it bowed to government pressure, nor is it even necessary for the recipient to have complied with the official's request. A credible threat may violate the First Amendment even if the victim ignores it, and the threatener folds his tent, close quote. Moreover, the government need not speak its threat aloud if, given the circumstances, it is fair to say that the message intimates some form of punishment. That's another close quote. This is a very good statement of the law. You see, this multi-factor, non-exclusive test is a good one because it tends to expand the freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment to the maximum extent. And that's because the test considers the totality of the circumstances and can be satisfied by even subtle government conduct. The Fifth Circuit then moved on to apply the test of either significant encouragement or coercion to the censorship activities of the Biden administration that the plaintiff states had alleged. Starting with the plaintiff's allegations against the White House and the Surgeon General with respect to censorship of speech regarding COVID and vaccines, the Fifth Circuit concluded that, quote, the White House, acting in concert with the Surgeon General's office, likely coerced the platforms to make their moderation decisions by way of intimidating messages and threats of adverse consequences, and significantly encouraged the platform's decisions by commandeering their decision-making processes, both in violation of the First Amendment. The Fifth Circuit observed that White House officials coerced the platforms into action via repeated, urgent, and uncompromising demands to moderate content, asking the platforms to remove posts ASAP or to remove entire accounts immediately, and that they were both persistent and angry in their request. The White House officials expressly and implicitly threatened retaliation if the platforms did not comply with their requests, mentioning the prospect of legal reforms like removing Section 230 immunity or enforcement actions. The Fifth Circuit also noted that officials made inflammatory accusations, such as saying that the platforms were poisoning the public and killing people. And when platforms failed to comply quickly enough, White House officials warned the platforms that the officials were internally considering our options on what to do, that their concerns were shared at the highest, and I mean highest, said one email, levels of the White House, and that the president has long been concerned about the powers of large social media platforms. So in light of all that, the Fifth Circuit concluded that the White House officials' statements were definitely coercive. In other words, the Fifth Circuit correctly concluded that the government violated the First Amendment by threatening and coercing social media platforms to do its bidding and censor speech. The Fifth Circuit didn't stop there, however. Even though coercion alone would be enough to establish a First Amendment violation, the court went on to analyze whether a First Amendment violation was also established on the basis of significant encouragement. And the Fifth Circuit concluded that indeed it was. The Fifth Circuit wrote, quote, we find that the officials also significantly encouraged the platforms to moderate content by exercising active, meaningful control over those decisions. Specifically, the officials entangled themselves in the platform's decision-making processes, namely their moderation policies. The Fifth Circuit then went on to consider whether the FBI likely coerced or significantly encouraged social media platforms to censor or suppress speech. Again, on both coercion and encouragement, the Fifth Circuit concluded that the FBI did likely violate the First Amendment. The court wrote, beyond taking down posts, the platforms also changed their terms of service in concert with recommendations from the FBI. For example, several platforms adjusted their moderation policies to capture hack and leak content after the FBI asked them to do so and followed up on that request. Consequently, when the platform subsequently moderated content that violated their newly modified terms of service, that is, results of hack and leaks, they did not do so via independent standards. So the court found that the FBI entangled itself in the social media platform's decision-making processes regarding moderation. The Fifth Circuit then turned to the CDC's request for censorship and content moderation. Again, the Fifth Circuit concluded that CDC officials likely significantly encouraged content moderation decisions, which means that the CDC also violated Americans' First Amendment rights. With respect to CISA, the National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases in the State Department, while the Fifth Circuit overturned the lower court's injunction. But remember, this was an appeal of a preliminary injunction, not an appeal of the final judgment in the case. So the Fifth Circuit held that with respect to those three agencies only, there was not, at this stage, sufficient evidence to find that it was likely that those groups coerced or significantly encouraged the platforms. But there is more discovery to come, and more evidence will undoubtedly be revealed. Still, this Fifth Circuit decision is truly remarkable. The Fifth Circuit held that the White House, the Surgeon General, the CDC, and the FBI all likely coerced or significantly encouraged social media platforms to moderate content, rendering those decisions state actions and thus violating the First Amendment. Throughout this litigation, the Biden administration has attempted to justify its censorship via social media activities by claiming that they are only targeting misinformation and disinformation. How can they be blamed for making sure Americans are safe from the horrors of disinformation? Well, guess what, Joe? We, the American people, are smarter than you think, and we are entitled by the First Amendment to decide for ourselves what information is credible and what information is not credible. You don't get to decide for us. And now the courts have completely and thoroughly rejected the Biden administration's ridiculous arguments. Remember several months ago when Biden announced he was forming a new disinformation governance board? Well, that was supposed to sit within the Department of Homeland Security. Biden pulled the proposal because public backlash was swift and fierce. It quickly became clear that Americans will not tolerate a Ministry of Truth-style agency that polices our communications. We value our free speech. But that proposal for a disinformation governance board inside the Department of Homeland Security wasn't really a proposal for anything new. It was just a proposal that grew out of the Biden administration's already existing censorship operations. You see, they were having a tough time managing all the censorship requests and handling all the coordination with social media companies to make sure that viewpoints they disfavored were suppressed. The proposal for the DHS Disinformation Governance Board would have merely put all the censorship operations in one spot and made it easier to manage. It would also open the door for more staff and more funding. But here's the thing. We already have a Disinformation Governance Board in everything but name. We already have a Ministry of Truth. The revelations from the Missouri versus Biden lawsuit show that. Thankfully, the Federal District Court for the District of Louisiana and the Fifth Circuit have pretty much shut down the Biden administration's Ministry of Truth, at least for now. But the First Amendment is still in dire jeopardy. We need congressional investigations of the FBI, CDC, DHS, CISA, and all the other agencies involved in censorship. If the government can control the flow of information and suppress speech that it disfavors, then our elections mean nothing, and we don't have any kind of freedom in any meaningful sense. We must win the battle for the First Amendment. If we don't, we lose our country. We lose everything. So we should be very thankful to the Attorneys General of Missouri and Louisiana and their legal staff, great patriots who are leading the battle in one very important front in the war to save our republic. And now it's time for Behind the Headlines. Well, it is an honor to be on LindellTV, but whatever platform you're watching on, please like the video, subscribe to our channel. Doing each of those things helps us tremendously. Now on to Behind the Headlines. First up today, the Democrats are making things less safe. A very obvious statement for sure. Here in Minnesota, this has been done by the Democrats in many ways. The most recent are the changes that the Democrats made to Minnesota's Student Resource Officer Law, which imposes new additional regulations for police officers stationed inside schools. The new law is so restrictive that many police departments have decided to pull their officers from schools rather than put their officers in situations where they won't be able to intervene to prevent violence without the possibility of legal jeopardy. The law just creates too much uncertainty. Attorney General Keith Ellison has put out 2 legal opinions attempting to clarify the law. And Republicans are calling on Governor Tim Walz to convene a special session to fix this mess. His response? Gather a few Democrats who are set to lose the next election and do a photo op where they say they're looking into strengthening public safety. Very typical of the left. Just all talk, no action. So what does all this mean? Well, it means our children are at heightened risk of violence here in Minnesota. The Democrats can come up with reasons why they wanted the law changed, but what it does in effect is make it harder for men and women of law enforcement to protect our kids. It's scary stuff indeed. What was the problem with student resource officers in the law before? Did they go to their assignments and do their jobs well? Well, of course they did. And so why change the law? There was no reason to change the law. It's because in Minnesota and many states across the country, the Democrats have launched a war against the police. That's really what this is about. This war will never affect their kids. So many Democrat leaders have private security and gated communities in the works. They want your kids to be without law enforcement to protect them from violence, while their kids are safe. We should always fight to do what's right, especially when it comes to protecting our children. But to point out irony, many of these places that SROs, the student resource officers, are being taken out of are schools that are in areas that voted heavily for Democrats, especially in the suburbs. Minneapolis and St. Paul suburbs where Democrats turned out in healthy margins are now feeling the consequences of the last election. The suburbs are an essential part of Republicans' path to victory. Suburban Democrats have to wake up from this madness. Pray that they do. Pray for the men and women who wear the badge, and pray for the safety of children in our schools. Next up, imagine you're in ancient Carthage, say, and you see 140,000 Romans approaching your border. What would you think? Would you think everything is okay? Or would you think that maybe an invasion is about to occur? Well, chew on that for a little while you hear about this. CBS is reporting that Biden's border strategy is being tested as 140,000 migrants who flooded across our southern border in the first 20 days of September alone. 140,000 migrants in 20 days. That is unprecedented. While the United States is sending Ukraine billions of dollars in weapons and aid every week or two, it seems, our politicians have decided to completely ignore the invasion going on at our own southern border. We see states like New York now pleading with migrants to stay away because we are full, as Governor Hochul put it. I should have come up with that idea a little bit earlier. Before the illegal immigrants were showing up on their own doorsteps, Governor Hochul in New York was a far-left sanctuary governor. Now she's taking a tone that sounds a bit more conservative. Well, why is that? We don't have the resources to take in this many people. New York City doesn't. The country doesn't. Not all at once, not illegally, and not when our economy is struggling, especially not when we're struggling like we are. So many Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, and the left expects us to take in 200,000 more people every single month. It's absolute insanity. The left always uses the outlier case to try to prove the general rule. We have an asylum process. When we're talking about people, particularly women and children, who are under the threat of despotic government and really suffering, or the vicious cartels, of course we should help them. But these videos coming out, whether it's from Italy or France or England or people coming across our own border, we're seeing that a lot of the people flooding across, they're not women or children. They're military-aged men. Donald Trump put it best. Mexico isn't sending their finest people. We have to put America first. That's exactly what we need to do. Third up today, COVID is back. Well, at least according to the political elite. Yes, the Biden administration came out with exciting news that COVID testing kits would be free once again. Lately, it seems that COVID is getting popular with the leftists. We've seen some cities and schools start the mask mandates up again. We've heard of new, allegedly stronger variants that the last 7 or so jabs apparently don't seem to be able to stop. Most of you probably know why COVID is back in action. Some of you probably guessed that this would happen. Biden and the Democrats are doing lousy in every single poll. That's what's behind this. They're losing independents. They're even losing some Democrats. Crime is tearing apart our cities and our suburbs. Drugs, especially fentanyl, pour across our southern border and are killing Americans every day. The economy, awful. World peace, well, we have the most unstable world stage since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Our enemies, China and Russia, are forming alliances. Our friends, France, Brazil, India, are strengthening relations with those bad actors. America first has become America last, and Americans are sick and tired of all the losing that President Biden has done. The Democrats are scared because leftism has collapsed in front of their faces. They won everything, and their utopia is an absolute nightmare. So, like the citizens of Gotham, they're calling Batman, but instead of Batman, it's COVID. And instead of the bat signal, it's mask mandates and the 20th booster shot. They figure COVID is the one shot they have to win. It's the only issue they remain popular on. The Democrats use fear to win elections. Fear is a powerful driver. COVID was unknown, and most of us are not experts in the medical field. So they prey upon that fear. They prey upon the fact that we don't know much about this, and most people don't, and they use it to gain political power. FDR once said that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. There's a lot of wisdom in that. Here's one thing. The things that frighten us are oftentimes the things that are most worthwhile to do. Leaving home to make a life for yourself is frightening. Raising a family, parenting kids is frightening. Following Moses out of Egypt, well, that must have been very frightening too. The brave men who stormed the beaches of Normandy, that had to have been terrifying. Conquering fear and overcoming challenges is what makes life worth living. It's where legends are born and history is written. It's what led to the creation of this country and the greatest civilization the world has ever seen. We have to convince Americans to once again be not afraid, have no fear, take heart. Christ has overcome the world. So live a life without fear. For the first time in history, the United Auto Workers Union is striking against all three major automakers in the United States at the same time. And it is not a coincidence that this is happening on Joe Biden's watch. His fumbling of the American economy, while pushing unrealistic and downright damaging green energy policies, has set the stage for all kinds of economic chaos, of which these historic strikes are a part. But labor strife is only the beginning, and rather a minor piece of our crumbling national puzzle. If Biden and the left get their way, our electric grid will be in serious jeopardy. Power will have to be rationed, and we'll be basically going back to the dark ages. First, let's take a look at a snapshot of the economic ruin that has set in nationwide, starting with the most obvious issue, inflation. Even Democrats now admit that inflation under Joe Biden has been historically terrible. Since he took office in January 2021, prices have increased an average of 17%, and that's under metrics now that don't count a lot of important categories that are there of prices. And many sectors of the economy are far worse than that 17%. Energy prices have gone up almost 40%. Food costs have risen by over 20%. Much of the food price increase is directly related to Biden's 27% permanent funding increase for the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or food stamps, in 2021. In December of 2022, the government spent $11 billion on food stamp benefits. That is for 1 month. Compare that to $4.5 billion in December of 2019. This is just one example of how Biden has directly caused an increase in food costs for all Americans. Helicoptering borrowed, essentially printed new money into the economy just devalues the dollar and pushes prices up. How about the housing market? Well, maybe that's doing a little bit better. It is, if by better you mean a 27% increase in median home costs since Biden took office. Interest rates, they've risen from 2.8% to 7.2% as well, according to the Heritage Foundation. And now we get to add in the falling wages that are plaguing America. On September 12th, the Wall Street Journal had a headline that read, U.S. incomes fall for third straight year. They cite an inflation-adjusted median income of $74,580. But the number is even worse than that. If one adjusts the income for taxes, remember the COVID tax subsidies are now gone, that number falls to about $64,000, according to the Census Bureau. That is a drop of about 9% for 2022. Not good. I could go on and on. Let's just do one more. Driving is pretty important in modern society, right? We all have to get to work. Driving a car, deciding where you want to go and how you want to get there and when is part and parcel of American freedom. Well, according to the Institute for Energy Research, auto prices are up 25% since Biden graced the Oval Office with his presence. The average interest rate of a car loan is now about 9.5%. Okay, that's all about all the economic doom and gloom I can take for right now. There's a lot more terrible data I could cite, but I think you get the point. And we are all living through the terrible impact of the Biden economy, feeling the pain. Bidenomics is not a good thing. Americans are making less money even as the things we buy are getting more expensive by the day. And it's not just things that are nice to have. We're talking about necessities for living. That means everyone is feeling the crunch, including striking auto workers. Add in the fact that Biden is well known as a friend of labor, and strikes were almost a certainty. These UAW employees watched about a month ago as 340,000 UPS employees, represented by the Teamsters, hammered out a new 5-year national master agreement. The deal carried large pay raises, an elimination of the two-tiered wage system, and put air conditioning units into their brown delivery vehicles for the first time. All this was secured under the threat of widespread strikes, of course. Now is the UAW's turn. So what do these strikers want? The union is asking for roughly a 36% pay raise, the elimination of a multi-tiered pay system, and a 4-day, 32-hour work week. That is frankly absurd. Who on earth works only a 32-hour work week? Nobody I know, that's for sure. That's called shooting for the stars to hit the moon. The labor negotiations broke down, and the historic strike began at the stroke of midnight on Friday, September 15th. 9% of the UAW's 150,000 union workers walked off their jobs at 3 plants: a General Motors plant in Wentzville, a Stellantis plant in Toledo, Ohio, and a Ford plant in Wayne, Michigan. Talks stalled even after the auto giants offered a 20% pay increase. But here's where it gets interesting. Ford Motor Company's CEO, Jim Farley, spoke with CNN the day before the strikes began. After discussing how he agrees with a pay raise and that the big three have offered several, he said that a nearly 40% raise for UAW would essentially put Ford out of business. Well, that makes sense. But then he gave some insight into the real reason the big three are pushing back. Have a listen.
There's a fine line here that we won't go past, which is we want everyone to participate in our success. But if it prevents us from investing in this transition to EVs and in future products, like the ones we have now, like new F-150, best-selling vehicle in the world, in the U.S., then everyone's job's at risk if we don't invest. So there's a line. The line isn't for us to go bankrupt. The line is somewhere in the middle, and the only way to resolve that is to actually negotiate.
Did you catch that? He said there's a fine line here that we won't go past, which is we want everyone to participate in our success. But if it prevents us from investing in this transition to electric vehicles, sounds like Ford, GM, and Stellantis, which includes Chrysler, Jeep, and Dodge, have been listening to one Joseph Biden. Yes, Farley is speaking for the big three when he says a 40% pay raise will put them out of business, and it might, but if that is the real reason for holding firm, then why bring up electric vehicles? Why not just say a 40% pay raise is not something that our business can absorb and stay afloat? To stay afloat, we'd have to take drastic action that would have unacceptable consequences to both our business and the American consumer. Earlier this year, Ford's Q2 earnings showed a strong company with $45 billion in revenue for the quarter, 12% more than the same period in 2022. Growing gas-powered truck, commercial van, and SUV sales are responsible for those sales increases. Electric vehicles, on the other hand, Ford admitted that it will lose $4.5 billion on electric vehicles in 2023 alone. It works out to be about $67,000 loss for every electric vehicle sold, every EV sold, even with massive government subsidies. More on that piece in a bit. And electric vehicle demand is falling across the board. Auto dealers are the canary in the coal mine for the auto industry. According to Business Insider, EVs are piling up unsold on dealer lots. While there was about a 54-day supply of vehicle inventory overall at dealerships earlier this summer, EV inventory was nearly double that. This trend is expected to continue as analysts are beginning to see a plateau when it comes to the EV share of the auto market. Maybe that's because as of August 2023, the average EV cost is over $53,000. And that's after an 18% fall from August of 2022. For comparison, a mid-sized car averages around $32,000, and a crossover, that's around $36,000. With wages falling and prices of nearly everything else going up, who wants to pay more for lengthy charging times and range anxiety? Some people have lifestyles that can't accommodate EVs, but many, many people don't, at least not with current and near-future EV range and charging considerations. So what is Ford doing? Why are they pushing EVs so hard that they are willing to endure a historic strike? And it isn't just Ford. Their actions are a representation of the entire U.S. auto industry. Ford's moneymakers are gas-powered trucks, SUVs, and commercial vans. The entire point of a business is to make money, to grow, and also to contribute to the economy, right? So why is Ford committed to building 600,000 electric vehicles in 2024? Why are they trying to hit 2 million by 2026? And why have Ford and GM stated that they want to stop making gas-powered vehicles completely by 2035? Well, have you ever heard of the government trough and the EPA? The Biden administration is going all out for electric vehicles. Early in his presidency, Biden announced a goal of having 50% of all new vehicle sales in the United States be electric by 2030. They have been pushing hard ever since. Just in April, the White House released a fact sheet about their new private and public sector investments for affordable electric vehicles. The sheet details over 60 commitments they worked out with various companies and government agencies. Here's a sample. First Student, a major supplier of school bus services, is committed to transition 30,000 fossil fuel-powered school buses to electric school buses by 2035. One quick note about that. Electric buses don't work well in cold climates. Up in Duluth, Minnesota, we had a situation where, it's very cold there. In the winter, and the city's on a hill, buses with electric power plants in them couldn't get up the hills. And also, the heating doesn't work very well and it drains the battery. So it just doesn't work for large swaths of the country. The city of Madison, nonetheless, is committed to converting all 900 gas vehicles in its fleet to electric vehicles by 2030. We Realize Incorporated is committing to add over 200,000 electric semi-truck level 2 and DC fast charging stations to its nationwide network by 2030. We are at electric big rigs already? That's a ridiculous pipe dream. Avanza EV, a new national initiative by Citizen Energy, is committing to deploy chargers and bilingual EV education, whatever that is, in at least 1,500 low-income majority Latino multifamily housing communities and engage at least 400,000 families by 2028 for all those low-income people buying $50,000 electric vehicles. Right, that makes sense. And remember the Inflation Reduction Act, the one that did nothing to help inflation but actually made it worse? Well, it provided $12 billion in grants and loans to help factories like Ford convert to electric cars. It even gave $3 billion to the post office to electrify their fleet by 2026. Then there was that so-called bipartisan infrastructure law that many of our side caved on. It invests, to use the Democrats' favorite euphemism for misallocating economic resources, $7.5 billion in electric vehicle charging, $10 billion in so-called clean transportation, and over $7 billion in EV battery components, critical materials, and minerals. Just a few months ago, at the end of June, Biden talked about investing $2 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act to speed up domestic manufacturing of EVs and resuscitate plants that are struggling. And they are definitely struggling. Just look at Ford. Speaking at Ford, it is interesting that Biden brought this up just days after the Department of Energy's Loan Program Office, the LPO, gave Ford a $9.2 billion loan for EV batteries on June 22nd. $9.2 billion. But I guess that isn't enough. We'll see more of those types of loans. Under Biden, the Department of Energy's Loan Program Office has seen its lending power skyrocket. The Inflation Reduction Act massively increased many of its loan programs, especially with respect to the so-called green energies. For example, it gave $3 billion to cover the credit subsidy costs of loans that build low-emission vehicles. They are talking about EVs here. There is no cap for these loans. The old $25 billion cap was repealed. Now they can lend any amount that the $3 billion in subsidy costs can cover. A subsidy cost is a fee paid to the government to offset the risk that the loan might not be repaid. In other words, the Department of Energy is handing out money left and right for green projects. So far, it has given over $20 billion in subsidized loans to companies for all kinds of green transportation and sustainable infrastructure projects. The $9.2 billion given to Ford is the largest loan it's ever given. And then we have the EPA's new rules. To speed up the forced transition to electric vehicles, the EPA has put out two new rules that drastically limit what vehicles can emit. These rules, one for light to medium duty vehicles and one for heavy duty vehicles, are the most stringent that have ever been proposed. In a nutshell, the rules set fleet-wide emission standards in grams of CO2 per mile. The standards begin with model year 2027, and the maximum emission levels fall each year until 2032. The only way to meet the standards is to sell enormous numbers of electric vehicles and vehicles with next to no emissions. In fact, the EPA itself estimated that automakers would have to make EVs 60% of their total light-duty vehicle sales to meet the 2030 standards. For 2032, it's 67%. For medium-duty trucks, it would be 46%. EPA Administrator Michael Regan proudly said the rules are the strongest ever federal pollution standards for both cars and trucks. Disgusting. They're forcing Americans to give up the internal combustion engine because they claim to know better, but they know nothing. Keep in mind that meeting the EPA's rules will require even more EVs than Biden himself proposed with his executive order on 50% EVs. Right now, EVs make up just over 7% of U.S. vehicle sales, up from 5.8% last year. But they need to be at 60% by 2030? That defies all market forces, and forcing economic change through government action never ends well for anyone. 60% EV sales by 2030 seems particularly unreasonable in light of recent polling showing that only 19% of U.S. adults say it's very or extremely likely that they'll buy an EV for their next car, while just 22% say it's somewhat likely. Almost half gave a flat no, according to recent polling by the Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research. Of course, this is all being done in the name of climate change, the left's favorite justification for robbing us of our individual liberty. We must save the planet from all the CO2 that wildfires and decomposing trees and tree leaves, dirty cars and trucks, right, are emitting. Electric cars will be our savior, except that they won't. In all his climate change euphoria, Biden has been crystal clear about eliminating fossil fuels. Just a couple weeks ago, Biden blocked all drilling on 10 million acres of land in Alaska and canceled several oil leases sold by the Trump administration. I think he hates oil even more than he hates Trump. What better way to promote EVs than to make gas expensive and eventually hard to come by? Almost all the new Department of Energy lending power is directed at green energy. And just this last May, Emperor Biden announced a new rule aimed at combating climate change. Fossil fuel power plants must cut their greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by 2035 to 2040 or close down. That is a tall order, one that will be impossible to meet. It's no secret that Joe Biden and the left want to remove fossil fuels from the American energy equation for good. They are at war with the internal combustion engine, and they are at war with nuclear power as well. In August, Biden made his fifth new national monument, one that was proposed in Arizona by the Grand Canyon Tribal Coalition. It covers over 900,000 acres of land that contains uranium that will, thanks to Biden and his climate alarmists, not be mined for nuclear power. In fact, early on in his presidency, Biden stated a goal to conserve 30% of America's land and waters by 2030. A full 30% of the nation will be off limits to drilling or mining. Here are just a few places he has placed on his list. 9 million acres in Alaska, in Bristol Bay and the Tongass forests. Boundary waters in Minnesota, 225,000 acres with a 20-year moratorium on mineral development. 770,000 square miles in the Pacific Ocean southwest of Hawaii. There are many more places. So where are we supposed to get our energy from? No fossil fuels, and I don't see any new nuclear power plants planned except one reactor in Georgia that will open in 2024. 4 years ago in California, the heartland of stupid radical leftism, regulators approved plans to retire the state's last nuclear facility, the 2.2 gigawatt Diablo Canyon power plant, by 2025. But they've been forced to extend its life until around 2030 because of the state's well-documented power problems. The leftists don't want nuclear either, so I guess we must go green. Biden and his leftist cronies are leaving us no other options. One problem. Even with all the investment into green energy by the Biden folks, the U.S. Energy Information Agency says only about 13% of our energy comes from renewable resources, and 16% of that is from wood burning. Wind and solar, the climate activists' favorites, only make up about 5.6%. And wind and solar can't produce stable baseload power because the wind doesn't always blow, and there are often clouds in the sky and snow on solar panels. Also, as you may have noticed, the sun tends to set and then rise again. So, fossil fuels are still king, with oil, natural gas, and coal making up almost 80% of our national energy sources. Unless we go for nuclear power, which we should absolutely do, that's how it has to be to maintain a stable power grid and keep our country going. But according to Biden and leftists, we aren't going nuclear, and we aren't going with fossil fuels. But we are going full speed ahead with electric cars and trucks, and even semi-trucks apparently, even though most don't want one, and they don't make any money for those who are building them. And even if you believe in the hoax of man-made climate change, it isn't clear how much EVs could possibly help the environment. Some studies show that manufacturing EV batteries results in higher carbon emissions compared to gas-powered vehicles, mostly because of the huge energy requirement of EV battery manufacturing. And then there is the issue of acquiring rare and difficult to mine elements like lithium, manganese, and cobalt. Extracting those metals and moving them across the globe has its own massive environmental footprint. But in the end, all those EVs, their factories, and the mining and transport operations need power. And that power isn't going to just spring up out of the ground ready for us to use. Now, let's go back and take a look at our lefty friends in California. Thanks to the California Energy Commission, we know exactly how much power the state of California produced and imported in 2021. Take a look at the bottom row on the screen. The state produced a bit over 194,000 gigawatt hours of power and imported almost 84,000 gigawatt hours from neighboring states and elsewhere. That's around 277,000 gigawatt hours total. Now look at that far right column. They get about 9% of their power from nuclear and 38% from natural gas, while wind and solar together add up to around 25%. So even in the leftist paradise of California, where they throw money into renewable energy faster than anywhere else in the nation, they can only generate 5% of their power with wind and solar. Keep in mind that California ranks as the third most expensive in the nation as of June 2023 when it comes to energy costs, coming in at 31.22 cents per kilowatt hour. They are behind only Connecticut, which had an explosive 25% jump in energy costs this year, and also the distant island state of Hawaii. All that renewable energy comes at a price. But here, let's do a little bit of math. According to the EPA, the median energy usage for a 2023 electric vehicle is 0.36 kilowatt hours per mile. Americans drive 14,263 miles per year, according to the Federal Highway Administration. That works out to about 5,134 kilowatt hours per year per vehicle. Biden wants half of new vehicles to be EVs by 2030, and there are almost 14 million households in California. Remember that to meet the new EPA emission rules by 2030, the EPA itself says that 60% of light-duty vehicles must be electric. So let's add 7 million new EVs to California, one for half the households. 5,134 kilowatt hours times 7 million works out to 35,938 gigawatt hours per year. So adding the EVs necessary to meet the EPA's new emission standards will require an amount of new power every year that is equivalent to nearly 13% of California's total power consumption in 2021, or 18.5% of their in-state power production for that year. It's ridiculous. You see the problem here. The reason I picked California is because it serves as an example for what leftists want to do to the entire nation. Do you think California's power grid can handle a massive drain equal to 13% of their power generation? No. Even if it's gradual over the next 7 years, they aren't building new nuclear power plants and have sworn to eliminate fossil fuels. And California has a rule that 35% of new car sales for model year 2026 be zero-emission vehicles, in addition to Biden's 50% by 2030 goal. Their green energy programs only cover a small portion of their energy needs, and even as those programs grow, the power needs of all those new electric vehicles will easily outstrip that growth. What will this do to the cost of energy? And what will this look like on a national scale? Will our power grid be able to handle all the new electric vehicles? Absolutely not. Remember that right now, electric vehicles make up less than 8% of the vehicle market. The explosion in EV sales pushed by Biden will cause chaos. In their lust for dealing with supposed man-made climate change and controlling the way that Americans get around, Biden and the Democrats are setting up a nightmare scenario. If they get what they want, there simply won't be enough power to go around. There'll be power rationing and brownouts and blackouts all over the place. Even if there was a serious attempt to bolster the power grid, there is no way it could be ready in time for 2030 and the new vehicle fleet comprised of 60% electric vehicles. Consider this. In the last 25 years, the U.S. has seen only 2 new nuclear power plants. Georgia added one new reactor this year, and Tennessee added one in 2016. The Georgia reactor took about 118 months to complete. The project projection when the construction began was 48 months. The reactor in Georgia has a nameplate capacity of 1.14 gigawatts, its maximum theoretical capacity. California's last nuclear power plant, Diablo Canyon, has 2 reactor units with a combined nameplate capacity of 2.26 gigawatts. In 2021, as the earlier chart showed, it generated 16,477 gigawatt hours of electricity. To cover the energy needs of 7 million new electric cars, California would have to build 4 brand new nuclear reactor units, and that would still be a little short. Remember, they want to close the Diablo Canyon reactor by 2030, and their climate plan calls for no new fossil fuel burning power plants. It's green or bust for them. I'm betting on bust. So what gives? Biden and the Democrats are forcing the nation into a power crisis under the guise of combating climate change. They must see the predicament they are steering us toward. Maybe they don't see it as a predicament. Just maybe their plan is far more insidious. What if they want a serious energy shortage? What if they want to be the ones to decide who gets the most energy, who gets the energy and who does not? Energy rationing would be a wonderful way to control people who might otherwise resist a march towards authoritarian socialism. Given what Biden and his ilk have already done to our nation, we must consider the possibility. I think it's the most likely one. This is but another reason to resist the left's unrelenting drive towards green energy and their radical climate change agenda. Our nation has the resources to be energy independent and the technology to become so, while also protecting the environment. There's no reason to completely ignore nuclear and fossil fuel energy sources while investing totally in expensive, immature green technologies that cannot come close to covering our needs. And there is certainly no reason to force a massive nationwide transition to electric vehicles when we simply do not and will not have the energy generating capacity to handle it, and also it ignores Americans' freedom. It is a shame that the leaders of the big 3 auto companies seem to be capitulating to Biden's green energy demands at the expense of their workforces. The best way to help auto workers obtain better wages and working conditions is to cast off the green agenda. And the best way to do that is to elect a new president who truly values and will protect Americans' freedom and prosperity. 2024 cannot come soon enough. Now it's time to answer a question from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question and have me answer it on the show, you can email your question to foundingprinciplesshow@gmail.com. Please include your name and town, your first name and your town. Today, our question comes from Nikki in Fargo, North Dakota, who writes, I heard that Silicon Valley Bank bailout earlier this year, and that bailout may have had something to do with China. Is that true? What's the connection? Well, that's a really good question, Nikki. And it is true. There is a connection between China and the Silicon Valley Bank bailout. Here's the connection. The Chinese Communist Party will directly benefit from Joe Biden's bailout of Silicon Valley Bank. Silicon Valley Bank was one of the only banks willing to work with variable interest entities, or VIEs, that Chinese companies use to raise foreign capital. As a result, Silicon Valley Bank had many Chinese VIE depositors, including companies with direct ties to the Chinese Communist Party, to the CCP. So Biden's bailout of Silicon Valley Bank depositors basically sent American tax dollars straight to those CCP-linked companies. When you consider the fact that Chinese companies with ties to the CCP wired millions of dollars through layers of shell companies to reach Joe Biden's family members and associates during and in the months after Joe Biden was vice president, one has to wonder, did the Biden family's financial ties to CCP-linked companies influence the president's decision to order an illegal bailout of Silicon Valley Bank, a bailout which the Biden administration had no statutory authority to order? I think the most likely answer is yes, it did. Thanks for your question, Nikki. Well, that's all for today's show. If you like the content we're providing and you're watching this on YouTube or Rumble, please like and subscribe. If you're watching on LindellTV, continue watching, tune in to LindellTV, and we'll see you next time on Founding Principles with Doug Wardlow. And remember, one more thing, the CCP must be destroyed.